Now, this is my favorite part of this panel. Let's see if you agree. Bernie, in 1959, you're working at AFCO on designing fuses for the Polaris missile.
Yes, I was.
And you were hired, let me just finish, you were hired by Bob Noyce to work at Fairchild on a secret project. What was your job function, and why were you moved to Detroit?
Okay.
Here we go.
I was working for a company called AVCO, AVCO, and we had a prime contract for the Polaris missile nuclear fuse. We had nothing to do with the missile itself, but we had a radar fuse we were building. So we used to go to the Department of Navy in Washington, D.C. for these constant meetings because they were micromanaging the project, the Navy was. And since I knew something about semiconductors and most of our people were tube people, they sent me with the sales force to go with them to explain to the Navy what we were looking at and what other methods we could do besides using tubes for the electronics. And we had experimented with some of the early parts from Texas Instruments. They were $250 JK flip-flops that they had built monolithically, but they connected them with gold wires that were jumper wires. And of course, they made no sense because if you're building something in a missile, vibration would be very simple. They're all shorted out. So, but I had spent some time looking at these things, and they charged us $250 a piece at TI. Somebody in the Navy must have tipped someone at Fairchild off that I had some experience with this particular type of product.
But Bob Noyce hired you. How did that come about?
Well, Bob Noyce called me. He didn't actually hire me. He called me on the phone and introduced himself and wanted to know what I was going to do. And I was interested in going into the semiconductor business on the West Coast. And he sent out one of the founders, Dr. Greenwich, Victor Greenwich, to interview me. And they interviewed me in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I was going to school and working. And he had a job for me, and he said, but he can't tell me exactly what it is. It's very secret, and I have to have a need to know. I said, well, what am I going to do? He says, well, your job is to train our sales force in the Midwestern part of the country and the eastern part of the country on how to sell this device.
A new product which is undisclosed.
I said, well, you got to tell me what the product is. He said, no, we can't. It's need to know only. So he says, you're going to move to Detroit, and...
you got that? The guy who's got to train sales engineers on the product, he doesn't have a need to know.
So he said he couldn't tell me. So they said I was moving to Detroit, so I quit my job, which I was already set to go to work for Philco Ford instead, but he's really a convincing guy. So I go to Detroit, Michigan to set up offices so the sales force in the Midwest and the sales force in the East Coast could come to my office and get trained. The people on the West Coast would be trained at the factory. So when I got there, the product still isn't working, and they still won't tell me what it is. So I go to open an office in Detroit, Michigan, which I'd never been to before, and this gentleman, Tom Bay, shows up from California to visit a customer called Burroughs. So he heard I was there, he didn't know who I was, he never met me, knew nothing about me, and he shows up, he says, this ain't gonna work. This product isn't ready to go, he says, and you're not going to sit on your dead ass in Detroit till we get it working. So he says, I'm sending you to Chicago to work for somebody there. I said, what do I do? He says, you're going to be a salesman temporarily. So I went to Chicago, and I met the manager of the office in Chicago. He didn't know I was coming.
What else is new?
So he said, I'll tell you what, we have a guy we're trying to send to Minnesota. He can't sell his house. So he says, you're going to Minnesota tomorrow. So I went from Detroit to Minnesota, and turns out the product wasn't ready for a whole year. It was the integrated circuit. And Noyce had...
It was actually a little more than that, wasn't it?
It was more than a year after I started, before they got it working.
That was like, what, the end of 61, early 62?
Yes.